Somebody unlocked a door on the Volga River, and a small group of American rocket engineers walked into a hall full of finished engines that officially didn't exist. This was the early 1990s, in a city about 500 miles southeast of Moscow. But every engine standing on that concrete had been built for a moon rocket that was killed in 1974 and broken up for scrap, for a program the Soviet Union then spent 15 years insisting had never existed. Nobody had lit one of these in about 2 decades. There was no program left to fly them on, no customer waiting, and by the time the Americans walked in, the government that ordered them built had gone out of business. Nobody rescued those engines. Somebody just kept paying for the building and kept the roof on it for 20 years, and that is the only reason anyone alive can tell you whether they worked. The vehicle they were built for was officially denied, so the obscurity here is a matter of policy rather than a figure of speech. Soviet officials spent the better part of 2 decades telling anyone who asked that there had never been a race to the moon, that the idea was an American invention, and that the enormous thing American spy satellites kept photographing out at Baikonur was a paper project nobody had funded. That line held until the 18th of December, 1989, when the New York Times ran a front-page headline reading, "Now, Soviets acknowledge a moon race." And there's something that keeps bothering me that no one else seems to talk about. If you know one thing about the Soviet moon rocket, it's probably that the first stage had 30 engines. 30 engines sounds absurd, and over the years that detail has turned into a kind of explanation all by itself. Of course the rocket failed, it had 30 engines. But the engineering record doesn't really support that conclusion. In fact, the engines themselves were one of the few parts of the program that proved exceptionally reliable. Some of those engines are still flying today, and one of them lifted a satellite off a pad in northern Russia in February of 2025. And there's a test report from a stand in California with that engine's numbers on it, written up after a firing that drew little attention at the time. Those numbers are why I'm telling you any of this. 30 engines only makes sense once you know the size of what they were bolted to. The N1 stood 345 feet tall, which is a 30-story building lying on its side on a railcar, and when fueled, it weighed 6 million pounds. At liftoff, its first stage produced about 10 million pounds of thrust against the Saturn V's 7.5 million, which made the Soviet moon rocket, on paper at least, the most powerful launch vehicle anybody has ever built. It was designed by a man the Soviet public wasn't allowed to know the name of, in a program that officially wasn't happening, on a pad in the Kazakh desert that American reconnaissance photographed for years without knowing what they were looking at. Sergei Korolev needed engines for it, and he couldn't get them from the man who normally built his engines. Valentin Glushko ran the country's premier rocket engine bureau, and the two of them couldn't agree on what fuel the vehicle ought to burn. So Korolev went outside the rocket industry altogether to Kuybyshev on the Volga and hired an aircraft man. Nikolai Kuznetsov had never built a rocket engine in his life. His name was on the NK-12, the enormous turboprop that hangs off the wing of a Tupolev Tu-95 bomber and still, 70 years later, makes a noise you can hear from the next county. Jet engines and rocket engines aren't the same machines, but both live or die by their turbo machinery. And Kuznetsov's people understood that better than almost anyone in the Soviet Union. And there's something I find funny about that. The biggest machine the Soviet Union ever attempted to build got its engines from a bureau better known for bomber engines than rockets, thanks to a long-running dispute between two of the country's most influential engineers over rocket fuel. Korolev needed something else from them too. There was no time and no money to develop one gigantic engine of the kind Rocketdyne was building for the Saturn V, so the plan became a lot of smaller ones instead. 24 arranged in a ring around the base, then 6 more added in the center, each producing roughly a sixth of the thrust of an American F-1. That's a great deal of plumbing and a great many parts that can fail. It's also, provided the engines are good enough, a completely reasonable way to build a rocket. In fact, the largest launch vehicle flying today lights more than 30 engines at once, and it no longer strikes anyone as strange. The N1 flew 4 times, and it failed 4 times, and none of those failures had the same cause. On the 21st of February, 1969, the first vehicle lifted off, and a fire started in the tail. The control system read the fault and shut every engine down at 68.5 seconds. On the 3rd of July that year, 2 weeks before Apollo 11 left the ground, the second one barely got off the pad, a turbopump let go inside engine number 8, and the entire vehicle came back down onto it. The blast destroyed Site 110 East, and rebuilding it cost about 18 months. They tried again on the 27th of June, 1971, and that vehicle began rolling in a way nobody had predicted, past anything the control system could correct, and broke up roughly 50 seconds into the flight. The fourth attempt, on the 23rd of November, 1972, got furthest of all. At 107 seconds, the 6 center engines shut down on schedule, exactly as programmed, and the shock of that shutdown, traveling back through the propellant lines, split them open. Fuel found the hot end of the vehicle, and it was gone before the second stage ever lit. 4 launches, 4 losses, and what I keep noticing is that a program running on that record was still getting closer every time. The 5th vehicle was nearly ready. It was fitted with a new generation of engines, and by every account, the problems that had killed the first 4 were understood and solved. It never flew. On the 22nd of May, 1974, Vasily Mishin, who had inherited the program when Korolev died on an operating table in 1966, was formally released from his duties while lying in a hospital bed. His bureau was folded into a new organization under Glushko, and Glushko's first act as its head, signed on the 24th of June, was to suspend all work on the lunar program. That decision, taken by itself, is defensible. He'd argued against this whole approach for a decade. He'd just inherited 4 failures and no successes, and the Americans had stopped flying to the moon 2 years earlier. What happened afterward is the part I can't be even-handed about. The 2 completed rockets were broken up. Sections of them turned up around Baikonur for years afterward, doing duty as sheds and shelters, and the official position of the Soviet Union became that none of it had ever taken place. The clearest account of that logic came from Yaroslav Golovanov, who covered the space program for Pravda. Secrecy was necessary, he said, so that no one would overtake us. But later, when they did overtake us, we had to maintain secrecy so that no one knew that we had been overtaken. That held for the 15 years after the shutdown. It finally broke in 1989, when a group of American aerospace engineers went to Moscow, walked through an institute, and were shown the lunar lander itself sitting on the floor. The lander wasn't the only Soviet secret that Americans had misunderstood. There was also a long-standing belief about the engines that powered the rocket itself. They burned kerosene and liquid oxygen in what's called an oxidizer-rich staged combustion cycle. Strip the jargon out, and it means the whole flow of liquid oxygen is routed through a small preburner first, lit with a little bit of fuel, and used as hot gas to spin the turbine that drives the pumps, before all of it carries on into the main chamber. Nothing gets thrown overboard, which is why the cycle is so efficient. The catch is what you're asking the machine to survive. The gas coming off that preburner is hot and very nearly pure oxygen, and hot oxygen at pressure doesn't just corrode metal, it burns it. Point that at the inside of your own turbine, and the turbine is what catches fire. Kuznetsov's people solved it by coating every metal surface the hot gas touched in an inert enamel, which sounds almost domestic until you remember that the coating is the only thing standing between the engine and a fire inside it. American engineers looked at the same problem and reached a different conclusion, and I don't think they were wrong. As propulsion researcher William Anderson of Purdue has pointed out, oxygen will burn most things if you give it a spark, and there was so much invested in the space shuttle that nobody at NASA was eager to pursue oxygen-rich engines. That wasn't laziness. Hot oxygen at pressure is a real materials challenge, and tackling it would have required time, money, and attention that were already committed to hydrogen. The result was a divergence that still surprises people. When Aerojet briefed the National Academies in 2013, it noted that every hydrocarbon rocket engine developed outside the United States since the 1960s had used the oxygen-rich staged combustion cycle, while the United States had never completed one. Which brings us to the real reason the N1 kept failing, and it has almost nothing to do with the number 30. Those first-stage engines used pyrotechnic valves. Small explosive charges opened and closed the propellant flow, which saved a great deal of weight on a rocket that needed every pound it could find, and once one of those valves had shut, it couldn't be opened again. That has a consequence nobody thinks about until they're the ones living with it. An engine that's been fired is finished. You can't test one and then fly it. So the engines bolted onto the rocket were never test-fired at all, because firing them would have used them up, and the quality of a batch was inferred by firing other engines from the same production run. Sergei Khrushchev, who worked in the missile industry and happened to be the leader's son, later said the sample was 2 out of every 6, and never the ones that went to the pad. And the cluster itself, all 30 of them running together on the same structure, was never static fired as a unit. Not once in the entire program. The Soviet Union never built a test stand large enough to hold it. So every complicated and violent thing that 30 engines do to each other when they run at the same time, the vibration, the plumbing resonance, the way the exhaust plume of one interferes with its neighbor, had to be discovered in flight 4 times, in public, at enormous expense. That's the single most expensive shortcut I know of anywhere in rocketry, and what gets me about it is that everyone involved understood precisely what they were trading away. Kuznetsov's bureau attacked the problem from a different angle. If they couldn't test 30 engines together, they would make absolutely certain that every individual engine worked before it ever reached the pad. The new engine, the NK-33, had its pneumatic and hydraulic systems deliberately simplified so that it could be fired, shut down, taken apart, inspected, and fired again. You could acceptance test the exact unit you intended to fly, which the earlier engine could never allow. 208 of them were built, 101 development articles, and 107 production units, and between them, they piled up something close to 100,000 seconds of running on test stands. None of them ever flew on an N1. The engine that solved the problem was finished after the last launch, and then the program stopped, and then everybody went home. Which puts us back at that hall on the Volga, 20 years later. By then Kuznetsov was in his 80s, and the country he'd built the engines for didn't exist. Americans were coming through Russia looking at hardware, and Aerojet had heard the performance claims for this engine and didn't believe them. That skepticism was entirely reasonable. Engineers are supposed to be skeptical of extraordinary numbers, and these numbers looked extraordinary. The engine was claimed to produce a chamber pressure of 2,109 pounds per square inch and a vacuum-specific impulse of 331 seconds. On paper, that put it roughly 20 to 30 seconds ahead of the Western kerosene engines of the era. Nothing in America had ever achieved that. Then they were shown the building. One of the Aerojet engineers who made that trip described it, on camera years afterward, in a phrase that does the job better than any specification sheet. It was, he said, literally a forest of engines, more than 60 of them, standing side by side in one room. So they asked to take one home. An unmodified engine, no refurbishment, and no upgrades, was created on the Volga and shipped to Aerojet's test stand at Sacramento in California. The objective written into that test program was a single line: verify engine functionality after 20 years of storage. Notice what it takes for granted. Nobody was asking whether the engine would beat its specification. The question was whether a sealed machine, built for a rocket that had failed 4 times, by a bureau with no customer left, in a country that had ceased to exist, would run at all. I'd have written the same objective, and I'd have expected the answer to be no. In the fall of 1995, they lit it. They fired that engine 5 times over the course of a month, for a total of 408 seconds, and took it from 58% of rated power all the way to 113%, well beyond anything it would ever have seen in flight. It did not degrade. More surprising still, Aerojet's measurements matched the Soviet acceptance data from the 1970s. The specific impulse differed by less than 0.6%. 20 years on a concrete floor, and the machine came back with the numbers it went in with. I'll admit that one stops me. Nobody improved that engine. The men who designed it were old or gone. The state that paid for it had dissolved, and the only reason any of this could happen was that somebody chose not to scrap it, and it kept going from there. Aerojet imported 36 NK-33 engines and 9 of the upper stage version, rebuilt them for American use under the designation AJ-26, and on the 21st of April, 2013, an Antares rocket lifted off from Wallops Island in Virginia on 2 of them. Engines drawn up in Kuznetsov for a lunar landing that never happened, flying an American vehicle out of a NASA facility 40 years after the program that ordered them was shut down. In Russia, the same engines went onto the Soyuz 2.1V, which first flew that December. The cycle itself did something stranger. The thing American engineers had walked away from as a materials problem not worth owning is now the standard for American engines. SpaceX's Raptor runs an oxygen-rich preburner as half of its cycle. Blue Origin's BE-4 is a pure oxidizer-rich staged combustion engine, and it flew for the first time on the 8th of January, 2024, carrying a Vulcan Centaur and a commercial lunar lander off Cape Canaveral in the dark. Nobody in America ever published a retraction. They just started building the engine. The paper trail for all of this is better than you usually get with Soviet hardware, and there's one detail in it I like more than any of the numbers. The 1995 test program was written up for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics 3 years later, and the authors were Aerojet and the Kuznetsov Bureau, together, on the same paper. Two organizations that had spent 30 years designing hardware to defeat each other's, sharing a byline about a moon engine that had sat in a shed. The figures I've given you come out of that paper and out of Aerojet's 2013 briefing, and where the two disagree, I've used Aerojet's. Now the parts that don't resolve, and there are 3 of them. The engine that carried this whole vindication blew up. On the 28th of October, 2014, an Antares lifted off from Wallops carrying cargo for the space station, and about 15 seconds after ignition, one of its 2 AJ-26 engines exploded. NASA's independent review team traced the proximate cause to a fire in the liquid oxygen turbopump of engine E-15, where the rotor lost its radial position and rotating parts began rubbing against stationary ones inside the seal package. But the team couldn't isolate a single root cause. It listed 3 credible ones: an inadequate bearing and seal design for this application, foreign debris, and a machining defect in the turbine housing that predated acceptance testing, and it declined to choose between them. NASA and Orbital didn't end up agreeing with each other either. Within a week, Orbital dropped the engine. Anybody who tells you this hardware's story finishes in triumph is skipping that launch. The story is a little less dramatic than I've made it sound. That America never finished an engine of this kind is on the record, and so is the reason. What isn't on the record is any credentialed person calling the cycle impossible. Scott Manley makes the fair version of the point, which is that American engineering had chosen hydrogen and poured its money there. Nobody in the United States tried this cycle and failed at it. That matters because it turns the story from a technological defeat into a story about different priorities. And the middle of this story, the part everyone loves best, is the part I can support least. The version you'll hear everywhere is that a destruction order came down and one man defied it. No such order appears in the archival record. Asif Siddiqui's History of the Soviet Lunar Program, published by NASA, covers the shutdown and the dismissals and the demotions in detail, and mentions no instruction to destroy the engines anywhere in it. What exists instead is the account the men at the Bureau gave on camera in the year 2000, decades after the fact, saying the engines were headed for scrap and were kept on Kuznetsov's own initiative. I believe them, although I can't show you the paperwork. Kuznetsov himself died in Samara on the 30th of July, 1995. The Sacramento tests ran that fall. Nobody built another engine, either. Production never restarted, so a room full of surviving hardware proves something, and the point is simpler than it sounds. Those engines weren't saved because anybody knew what they'd be worth. Kuznetsov didn't preserve them as an investment or as a protest, and by every account, he couldn't stomach the arithmetic of melting down machines that worked, so he kept them, paid for the room they stood in, and did nothing else about it for 20 years. The deeper lesson, I think, is about what the shutdown actually destroyed. Stopping the moon program in 1974 was an engineering judgment and a defensible one. Making it unmentionable was not. For 15 years, the only people on Earth who knew what was standing in that building were forbidden to say so, and a technology that would have changed the entire Western argument about rocket propulsion sat on a concrete floor because the country that owned it had decided the subject was an embarrassment. Nobody had to rescue that hardware. It needed somebody to be allowed to open the door and say out loud what was inside. The Bureau didn't improve those engines across 2 decades and couldn't have, so the credit for what they did in California belongs entirely to design work finished before 1974, and the loss belongs to the 15 years when nobody was permitted to mention that the design work existed. Go and look at that site on the Volga today, and there's nothing to see. On the 5th of February, 2025, at 4 a.m. Universal Time, a Soyuz 2.1V lifted off from Plesetsk in northern Russia carrying a military satellite, and the engine underneath it was the last one. The stock ran out. The racks that held the forest of engines are empty now, and they're empty for the best reason available, which is that every last one of them eventually got used, one at a time, across 30 years, by people the men who built them never met. Stories like this turn up far more often in the history of flight than the official accounts admit. A program is canceled, the records are filed away, and the hardware sits forgotten until somebody decades later discovers what it was actually capable of. Almost nobody follows the story all the way to the end. Subscribe, and I will keep following it.